How long does it take you to write an analysis? For me, I'm a twice reader. Do you know what that means? So, in the exam, that means I need to read the text once during reading time, and then I do another quick read before I start to write. A second quick read. That adds quite a bit of time to my analysis allotment for the exam. You might not know now how long it takes you to write an analysis, but you certainly need to, because you do not want to be in a situation where you haven't got enough time in your exam. This is Section 5, Exam Preparation, and this lesson is Exam Overview. What's in this lesson? The end-of-year exam, terms and conditions, past exam text forms, authors and issues, exam task instructions, expected qualities for the mark range, advice from the external examination report, and an exam preparation list and plan of attack. The most relevant study design dot points here are, quite a few, identify, analyse and apply, intent and logical development of argument, different evidence the author uses to support arguments, language used by the author to position or persuade an audience to share a point of view, the effect of the author's identity and context on the intended audience, role of visuals to support and enhance argument, and features of print, audio, and/or audiovisual texts. Firstly, let's look at the end of the year examination terms and conditions. The English exam is usually the first exam. It's worth 50% of your total English study score. It's 3 hours and 15 minutes in length. That's 15 minutes reading time where you cannot pick up a pen and 3 hours writing time. It's set by an external panel and it's usually completed in February of the exam year. It's marked externally by assessors appointed by VCAA. So English teachers current and retired have to apply. It's comprised, the exam, of 3 sections. They're equally weighted and they're worth 20 marks each. Section C is analysis of argument and language, what we're studying in this area of study. An exam booklet or booklets is provided, and answers must be written in blue or black pen. Writing in grey lead, not permitted, and no pink pen or red pen. A print dictionary is permitted, and examination room protocols include no notes, no speaking, no moving around, and no mobile phones. An interesting fact to keep at the back of your mind there is over 40,000 students sit the exam. Let's have a look now at what's been on the past exams, the forms, authors, and the different issues. You can maybe see some similarities. We'll start with the 2023 sample exam, and this exam, is what our sample analysis response is based on in the next lesson. So the form for this one, social media post with 2 visuals. So it was one text with the 2 visuals embedded or integrated. It was from the author, was a member of the Strappleton Community Voice social media member, just concerned local. The issue and the purpose, it was to warn and educate the fellow members in the group about the dangers of feeding wild birds. 2023 exam was an open letter, the form, from a group of young musicians. They're the authors. So it was a group. And the open letter had 2 visuals, a bit similar to the 2023 sample exam. The issue and purpose, it was a proposal for a music festival to reinvigorate a community. The 2022 exam was a podcast transcript with 2 visuals. Once again, the similar main written text with the 2 visuals. It was about, or the purpose and issue was the condemnation of a development proposal that threatens the environment. And It was the author of the podcast who was a concerned local. And the 2021 end of year examination, section C text, social media post by a cinema marketing manager, there's your author, and it had 2 visuals. So here we've got, of course, vested interest where you've got the marketing manager and an easy dual purpose here. So while it was a plea for residents to increase their patronage of the cinema in order to prevent its closure, that was on one level. On another level, it was anti-streaming. Also, good point to remember, the exam is written by an expert panel, often completed, as I said earlier, in the first few months of the year. Also to note that when the panel writes the exam, they need to have in mind, of course, the VCAA study directives, but they also need to, perhaps a little bit tricky to say, but they need to concern themselves with an issue that has relevance, doesn't have to be particularly fantastically interesting, but it cannot be one that's going to incite opposition from schools. So it's never going to be anything super, super contentious. Your exam task instructions, and this is taken from the 2023 sample exam. In this section, you are required to analyse the use of arguments and language to persuade an intended audience to share the point of view expressed in an unseen persuasive text. Okay, so this is one big text with some visuals. You are asked to read the background information, super important, on this page and the material on pages 14 and 15, because it's the entire exam booklet for sections A, B and C, and write an analytical response to the task given. For the purposes of this task, the term language refers to written and spoken language, and visuals refers to images and graphics. Refer to the assessment criteria contained in the on the examination booklet or in the examination booklet on page 16. This section is worth 1/3 of the total marks of the exam. So we have those 3 sections and they're equally weighted. Your actual task, write an analysis of the ways in which arguments, written and spoken, and visuals are used in the material on pages 14 and 15 to try to persuade the intended audience to share the point of view presented. Not your point of view, but the point of view in the task. Here are the expected qualities for the mark range for section C. So they're marked out, your section C analysis task is marked out of 10. It will be marked by 2 assessors, and if there is more than a 10% gap, then it gets marked by a 3rd assessor, and so on. It can be marked up to 5 times. So here, when you're an assessor, you are expected to know these qualities. This is what you look for. So your first impressions of a student's work, you're thinking, okay, within the range of 0 to 10, 1 to 10, is it high, is it medium, or is it low? Now, then you further refine and you look, okay, if it's high, is it really high, or is it sort of just on the cusp? If it's medium, is it a high medium or is it a low medium? And this is how the assessors work through the pieces. The assessors themselves do massive training sessions beforehand where they work through tasks and responses that have already been marked by the chief assessors and the panels. And there's lots of discussion. It's a very, very fair process. So let's have a look here. Of course, our top ones, a 9 or a 10. Demonstrates perceptive understanding of contention. So let's look at what they're looking for. Development of argument really clearly, as constructed in the text, and the point of view expressed. So how they develop their point of view and construct their argument. Demonstrates sophisticated insight into the ways in which written and spoken language and visuals Okay? Do not forget the visuals. Complete or complement the arguments and are used to persuade the intended audience. So what's going to be the impact? And also the response uses sophisticated and precise language. So that's the very top one that you're aiming for. Lots of other ones you can see through. Visuals are everywhere. Do not forget these visuals. Okay? Competent expression, fluent expression, uses language confidently. That's when you're getting up into the high category. Okay? If you're just competent or fluent, you might just be in that middle category. So it's really worthwhile trying to improve your vocab, starting with verbs, adverbs, adjectives, knowing all those terms, especially from that lesson, How to Upgrade, the lessons How to Upgrade Your Analysis, and 4 Fast Ways to Improve Your Language Analysis. Okay? If we look at the next slide, we can see we're still in the middle until we get down to the low here. Okay? When we look at low, looking right down the bottom here, shows little understanding of the material, minimal knowledge of the task, uses language that is not always clear. This is when students don't even analyse at all. Sometimes they'll just summarise or they'll run completely out of time and maybe only get a couple of lines down. In this middle section, which of course, because it's all the normed curve, so this is where we have lots of students in this middle section, we've got adequate understanding of contention and argument, basic awareness of the ways. So sometimes there might be listing, things like that. They might only look at rhetorical questions, inclusive language and statistics, because they're easy things to spot. And they haven't really discussed maybe the argument very much at all. They're actually more concerned with the language. And then we get down to basic, very basic, okay? So it's really helpful to know all this stuff before you sit the exam. Always try to do practice exams, and certainly under timed conditions. One of the very important things that you can do before going into your exam is to look at previous examination reports. So there are about 300 assessors, and they're all appointed by VCAA to mark the English exams. Your teacher does not mark your own exam. We don't know. It's all de-identified. The exams are split up, the 3 sections. There's this marvellous machine that does all that. And then you mark in batches from each of the sections, A, B, and C. So you change around a bit. This is what the assessors do. Now, general advice comes in the form of an external examination report every year. Usually comes out or is published around about March. Okay, there'll be general advice sections, and then there'll be more detailed advice for sections A, B, and C. So here we've got some extracts. Assessors look to reward students' capabilities and skill. They really do. They don't look to downgrade you at all. They always look for the good stuff. And there is no single expected response. There is no set way to write an analysis, and there is no set contention, and students will have different opinions. And as long as you can support your interpretation, that's fine. Assessors rewarded responses that explained how the argument was purposefully constructed. Very, very valuable, particularly in the current study design, to persuade a specific audience and how language, all these how terms, was used to reinforce those ideas. Students are free to analyse parts of the text as they saw being designed to impact the reader. So these are the key points. Remember, you cannot analyse everything. Okay, you simply not have time. So you've got to look at what are these key points that really point to different points in the argument that impact on the reader. There's no expectation that within the time constraints of the exam, an exhaustive analysis of every part. Some students think that they need to write at the start, and if there are 7 paragraphs, they need to make 7 points. You don't need to. You focus on the key ones. The distribution of marks, as I said, is this norm curve. The average for last year, 5.6 out of 10. And you can see here, this is where lots of your marks are. You can see how very few get 10. And you can see that we have some who don't even attempt this section because they've run out of time. Let's have a look now at some more general advice. I love this first point. Student made use of acronyms provided by their teachers. And you know, I've told you in the past, there's loads of different ones. Many were scrawled in the margins. Teachers will be delighted with this evidence that students listen to advice, and so are the assessors, that's given, and these tips help students under the stress of the exam. So it is really not uncommon to see in the margins, because you have a big box and there's margin around the outside, where you'll see some students write, they might write CC, FV. This is, you know, whatever their ones are. There's loads of different ones. You can have these ones. I think we were using this one in Pacific. We had like that, I think, which is long. Some did that, and then some shorten them. There's loads of those things. Really, really good. Responses that explained how an effect was achieved were rewarded more highly than responses that can only identify the linguistic feature. So it's not enough to talk about what a linguistic feature is and to use the relevant meta-language. You've got to say how it complements the argument, how it impacts on the audience. Some responses simply discussed the content of each paragraph in a letter, which didn't demonstrate any understanding of the way the writers strategically presented ideas. Like, all this argument construction is deliberate. More effective analysis used the sequencing of ideas, this is within the argument, to logically divide their analysis. So some students painstakingly say, look, does this first, second, third, fourth, fifth, instead of maybe thinking, okay, how does the author introduce the argument? How does the author build on the argument? And how does the author finish the argument? Even just basic sections like that. Many responses still identified tone in the introduction without any consideration of its purpose, or that tone may have changed in the text. Now, it's not essential to identify tone in the introduction. If you do, or if you want to point at a tonal shift, you need to say from what to what. You don't just say uses a friendly tone. It sort of has no effect there. So maybe you drop tone altogether, put it in another paragraph where you're going to give it a little bit of a more explanation, or do so concisely in your introduction. You also don't need to discuss or analyse tone in every single paragraph. As the visual was purposely embedded in the text, right? So it's within that written text. The standalone visual analysis paragraph tended not to explore how it was connected with writers' ideas and use of language. And as this is really works with what we were talking about before in earlier lessons, particularly for the SAC, if you've got an embedded or integrated visual, attach your analysis to an argument point in your paragraphs. Don't give that visual a standalone. If it is a completely separate text, then it has its own contention, everything, and you can discuss it separately. However, the 2023 sample exam is one big major written text with two visuals embedded. So we might not get a standalone visual text for a couple of years till it evolves a bit more. Here's another part here, areas for improvement. Cannot stress how good this examination report information is. There is a difference between summarising the arguments and ideas in a text with embedded quotations or descriptions, and purposefully including quotations to explain how. So this first one, you want to avoid just writing big summary with quotes. You've got to do the how. Rather than just listing arguments, linguistic elements and features of visuals, it is important to explain the ways in which the elements of the text are constructed to persuade a specific readership to embrace the idea of the music festival. That was what the topic was for the 2023 exam. We are always looking at this how. How do they do it? And then we get down to the impact about why. Okay? Avoid analysing textual elements as if they are independent aspects of the text, and instead explore how the writers convey ideas and the interconnections and how these link to purpose. So they don't want you to just talk about the visual, but not connect it to the argument or the purpose. So I think one of the really big important things here is the interconnections between the text elements, between the arguments, the language, and the form features. Okay. And in here we've got all our, remember our umbrella persuasive strategies, all of that. So you can have tone all in there. How do they all interconnect? And then you've got to add the author's identity, like if they got a vested interest, and what's their purpose? Have they got more than one? So it's all got to interlink. So important it is for you to sit back and go, okay, what are the big picture questions here? What do I need to look at first before you go into sort of more or greater detail? The last piece of advice here that I've extracted is the qualities of high scoring responses. And I think it's really important to have a look at this. A clear sense of range of the target audience. Okay, know who it is that they're targeting because this affects appeals, etc. The young and the old. Is it business owners, supporters of the traditional garden festival? So this was from the 2023 exam. So here it was the young musicians, a group, wanting to have a musical festival. So they were aiming at citizens who were young and old. So it's quite a broad audience, this one. Business owners, as well as the supporters of this traditional garden festival, which has sort of gone down the tubes a bit. So it was a really broad audience, and even though they were a young group, they had to target both, which required, I think, from students looking at it, required a little bit of careful reading there and reading between the lines. Also, an understanding of the development of the argument and the strategy behind this sequencing. Why do we start an argument a certain way? Why do we start with the friendly? Why do we start with praise for existing conditions? Things like that. It's all deliberate. And its purpose to both establish a music festival and empower the younger residents to create change. Also, discussion of connections across the material. Don't get sucked into just doing that first part and running out of time. And your analysis has to be sustained and purposeful. Always the how and then the why, not just listing what gets done. Okay, what can you do before the exam yourself to prepare? So here we've got a checklist and you can tick off all of the following. And if you can't, then perhaps you haven't prepared well enough. So things you really need to do beforehand. Create an exam revision timetable and make sure you have a plan of attack for the exam, how you're going to approach it. We'll look at that soon. Make sure you've read past external examination reports. Don't just stick to the last one, 2023, which was the last one at this time of recording. Go back a bit further because you can find out lots of information, lots of good vocab to use. You don't need to go back too far, okay? So probably just the last few years. Make sure you are familiar with assessment criteria and criteria descriptors. You can download copies of the sample exam. So it's really easy to do and available. Can you remember the acronyms that you use for your introductions and body paragraphs? Have you practiced writing analysis using past exam booklets? Once again, you can download these, and under timed conditions. So a page on the exam booklet roughly equates to 3/4 of an A4 page. It's worth knowing all this sort of stuff. Have you made at least 6 different contention and 6 different argument verbs? Have you got a list with those? And have you got 6 different how verbs? So that's 18 verbs. I would also add some audience impact verbs. And then you can have other lists with adjectives and adverbs that you'll use. Have you practiced using a print dictionary under timed conditions? How long does it take you to find a word if you need to? Have you revised Didrolo lessons on knowledge and skills and how to write? This is section 3, and this section 5. Sometimes too, students who have particularly trouble with spelling, correct spelling of meta-language, for example, they might have trouble with opinion or article. They're really common ones. Sometimes just having those on a list on a wall where you cite them is really, really good. You don't have to, I think it's not like actual memory in terms of I'm going to memorize this every day, blah, 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 blah. But sometimes just having them on the wall, maybe near where you study at your desk, you can recall them in an exam. And so you'll know, okay, I need to fix that up. Once again, when you're doing that, when you're editing in the exam, if you make a mistake, so for say you spell, common mistake is to spell article this way, just a neat cross out and write the correct spelling either above it or nearby. Don't be putting an asterisk and saying, look at the end page. Consider the psychology of the assessors. We read from a screen, we scroll, not too keen on scrolling back. We expect editing and crossouts, so that's all really, really good. Just try to do the correct spelling near your crossout, or if you want to change a whole sentence, write it near there if you can. Leave lines between paragraphs to help you do this. Also, just standard stuff. Make sure you have blue and black pens that work and they don't bleed ink all over the page, which make your work hard to read. Exam plan of attack is important. This can vary greatly depending on the individual. Have some idea of a plan of attack beforehand. So this means, how are you going to divide up your time? How long does it take you to write essays for sections A and B, as well as reading the background information and persuasive texts for C? So this is like, can you read through it all in the reading time, which is 15 minutes. So you should use most of your reading time, I think, to read background information and persuasive text in section C. So for me, I would use the reading time, I'd probably take 2 to 3 minutes to just check sections A and B and look at, okay, which topics will I do? And then I would spend the rest of the time, the 12 minutes, actually reading the background information and the unseen texts for C. But I'm a twice reader, so I need to read them twice. So I need to really get started there. Don't sit there in reading time and just have a quick look and then sit back. Use reading time. You must use reading time. Some students like to complete section C first, while others prefer to write their section A text response while they can remember all the key quotes. There's no hard and fast rule. You do whatever works for you. But how do you know what works for you? And this is where you need to test your plan of attack in timed practices before the exam. Now, I'm not saying that you need to always do 3 hours and 15 minutes. You certainly need to do at least one of those. But you then can say, okay, this is my plan of attack. So you may say, rightio, how long does it take me to write this one section? Let's see how I do that after you've had a go at doing the whole lot. So this is for you to write, writing a plan of attack for the exam. How long will it take you to write essays for sections A and B, as well as the background information, reading the background information, and persuasive text for section C? What order will you complete the 3 sections of the exam, and how will you use your reading time? So just jot that down now. See what you think. So here's a sample here. I was talking about this first part before. 2 to 3 minutes to think about and decide on topics for section A and B. And sometimes be careful there. Sometimes that you first look and you go, oh, instantly, yep, I'll choose topic 1 for section A. And then I've seen many times a student comes back, they can do their introduction, 2 body paragraphs, and then they haven't got a third, and perhaps they should have chosen the second topic. So give it another look. That would be my suggestion. 12 minutes to read section C, including background information and unseen text. Now remember, you cannot pick up a pen during that time. Here, this sample, 65 minutes for section C. Now that would be for me a second read and quick markup of background information and text, just, using our 1A argument, 2A another argument point, C for contention, whatever your code is, just really, really quickly. Might have, your paragraph acronym on the side, something like that. And then to write and edit, remember, edit no more than 5% of total time is a good rough rule of thumb. Some students might say, look, I might do my editing later. I will write it and then I'll go to section A and section B and then I'll come back and do the big edit. It's up to you. So here we have reading time, 2 to 3 minutes. Think about, decide the topics. 12 minutes to read section C, background info and unseen texts. Section C, do first. A second quick read might be all of it, might be not all of it. Mark up information and texts. Write and edit if you have time. Then you might say, okay, right, that's 65 minutes. Then I've got 55 minutes for section A. I'll write and edit that during that time. That leaves me 60 minutes for section B. Might require more think time. How are you going to change things to suit you? Write and edit. Now, you might change all of these. You might not need to be a second reader. You might say, right, I'm fine, I can write that. I can write an argument and language analysis in 60 minutes. So you take that 5 minutes, where else are you going to put it? You might need more time for section B. You might even need less time for section A. But you won't know this until you practice under timed conditions. Form a plan of attack, practice under timed conditions, and then revise your plan of attack. And don't panic. Sometimes if you have a massive panic, you go, oh, I'm really off track here, I've got to start again. You might end up spending more time. So maybe you have to say, no, stop here, move on, come back. All those sorts of things. Now, what do we know about the exam? Which of the following points about the exam is incorrect? Incorrect. A, the English exam is 3 hours and 15 minutes in duration. B, you can write notes on the exam paper during reading time. C, you may use a print dictionary in the exam. D, you must write your essays in blue or black pen. Or I don't know. Of course, the incorrect one is you can write notes on the exam paper during reading time. You cannot write anything during reading time at all. Which of the points from the external examiner report is incorrect? Responses that explained how an effect was achieved were rewarded. A more effective level of analysis saw responses that used sequencing of ideas to logically divide their analysis. Explore how the writers conveyed ideas and the interconnections between the text elements. Responses that identified tone in the introduction, even without explanation, were rewarded. Or I don't know. And of course, it's this one that's incorrect. Responses that identify tone in the introduction without explanation, they're not rewarded. So, in summary, what do we need to know? The VCE English exam, it's usually the first written exam, worth 50% of your total study score for English. 3 hours, 15 minutes in length, set by an external panel and marked externally by assessors, unlike your SAC. Comprised of 3 sections, equally weighted and worth 20 marks each. Exam booklet or booklets are provided. Answers must be written in blue or black pen, and a print dictionary is permitted. This will be checked. Usually it's just a flick through, just in case there's hopefully no notes or anything in there. Fast 5 exam prep tips. 1. Read external examiner reports. Use acronyms and templates to help you write. Create your own word lists of how verbs. Design your exam plan of attack, and I'd put and test beforehand and revise if you need to. Practice writing analyses under exam conditions, timed exam conditions. What's coming up next? The next lesson is the VCAA sample exam analysis. What does focus more on argument mean? And if we look at the speech bubble here, we've got, why can't I just write a summary, list all the language techniques and describe the visuals in a separate paragraph? Well, you could, but you would not receive a very high grade. So what you need to do is focus on analysing argument, language, audience impact, how it all works together. This is Section 5 exam preparation, the VCAA 2023 sample exam analysis. What's in this lesson? We've got the exam task and assessment criteria. This is for the sample exam. And we've got applying our 3 steps to this sample task. We've got some example, introduction and body paragraph with visual. We've got 10 top tips for exam and the 7 deadly sins to avoid. Most relevant study design dot points here. Identify, analyse and apply. Intent, logical development of argument, argument focus. The different evidence the author uses to support arguments, argument focus again. The language used by the author to position or persuade an audience to share a point of view. The effect of the author's identity and context on the intended audience. The role of visuals to support and enhance argument, not separately. The features of print and audio or audio-visual text, our form features. Now let's look at the Section C exam task and criteria as set out in the 2023 sample exam. The task, write an analysis of the ways in which arguments, written and spoken, and visuals are used in the material on pages 14 and 15 to try to persuade the intended audience to share the point of view presented. The assessment criteria, remember it's holistic, understanding of contention, arguments and point of view, analysis of the ways in which written, spoken and visuals are used to present or represent an argument, and to persuade intended audience, use of evidence from the text, how you use it to support analysis, use of fluent expression throughout, appropriate use of vocab and conventions of standard Australian English. Now, let's recap our 3 steps to writing an analysis. Step 1 was read the persuasive texts and answer the 5 big picture questions. These big picture questions, 1, what is the issue and its context? 2, what is the form or forms and who is the intended audience? And is there more than one audience? 3, how does the author's purpose, personal identity and context affect the audience? 4, how's arguments constructed to position the audience? And 5, how do language, visuals and features of different forms combine with argument to persuade the audience? Now, you will see the persuasive text that you have to analyse, but before them, there will be the background information. You don't analyse the background information, but you can find out some really important information from it to inform your analysis. So let's look now at the background information and see what you can find out. Read the background information below. Identify the author, her status, text form, purpose, and audience. See if you can complete this table. So when you read the background information, did you find these following answers to some of the big picture questions? The author, Daphne Lower, she was a resident and a member of Strappleton Community Voice. The text form was a post on a social media page. The purpose, to voice concern about the local area, and her audience was fellow residents and members of the Strappleton Community Voice Group. What else? What else did you notice from there? Sometimes I think it's always really good to take note about how place names and authors' names are spelt. Okay? You're given clear spelling of these names often in your background information. So just take a bit of care here. Now let's look at the actual persuasive text that is the 2023 sample exam. It's a main written text with 2 embedded or integrated visuals. You can download this from the link below, and you need to look at it, read it very, very carefully. I'm just going to whiz through just marking up some points, but we're looking at step 1, finding answers to those big picture questions. So I will put all of those answers quite detailed in a table after we have a quick look through. You won't have time to do that in the exam at all. It was just for us to discuss. But as you go through, you have to notice things very, very quickly. So we're looking for arguments, argument construction, and techniques that support. And of course, not forgetting the visuals. Okay, let's go. So we have here that it's the form, their form features, author's name, which we know all this already from background information. Okay, it's a personal opening, isn't it? I want to share with you a dilemma. VCAA love to put in key terms here. What's a dilemma? If you've got your dictionary there, you've got the perfect opportunity to find out exactly what it is and check the spelling. I encountered this morning. So, reference to the do not feed the birds, personal story. Okay, this is a very, very clear visual. It is a photograph, we need to know this, of a sign. What's the sort of tone there? It's very strong. This is an imperative. This is a do not do this. Really strong. Okay? This is not so strong. This is a dilemma. This is personal. This is a bit more emotive. What should I do, if anything? This is what went through my mind. And of course, we know this is an ellipsis, meaning thinking, thinking, thinking. Okay. We look here. So this whole text has something like 10 paragraphs of different sizes. Okay. Tonal shift, we can already see that the tone of that sign was imperative, very, very strong. This is like a command. Okay. When I was growing up, so here we go, we're back into a bit of history, we're back into an anecdote. So we've got personal dilemma, anecdote, talking here about everybody feeds the birds, or everybody used to feed the birds then, chips, bread, or whatever it is, all scattering stuff. Today, millions of Australians continue to feed birds. So why do we do it? Okay, so she's acknowledging that this is what happens. Next paragraph, it's easy to see. Feeding birds feels like an act of kindness. So she's sort of said, do not feed them. This is reasons why we have fed them. And she's so, like an understanding. Now, remember, her audience is her fellow members of this group. So appreciating here nature in our increasing technology saturated world, healthy for unwind. And she refers to this duck feeding dad again. She uses him earlier and she brings him up again, the duck feeding dad, thinks he's doing the right thing. Unfortunately, so this is a word that signals some changes. Unfortunately, despite the immense health benefits that humans gain from feeding birds, the same cannot be said for the birds. So you could say this is a tonal shift here as well. Yes, in some parts, blah, 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 but I wish more people understood that supplementary feeding, even though it's an act of love, is just the opposite. So it's this alternating style here that she's using. And it's a very interesting argument style because she's started very strongly, then she sort of says, no, I understand this, and then she's gone, no, this is supplementary feeding, and trying to explain. For me, her purpose is to inform and to educate as well. But she's trying to do it very carefully so as not to offend her fellow members of the group, which is her audience, her primary audience. She doesn't want to be offended because maybe they're feeding the birds as well and they don't realise the dangers of feeding the birds. And this is her whole dilemma. It's all framed around this, which is cleverly done. So downright dangerous. So here we're getting stronger again. I have read wildlife experts. Supplementary feeding, here is the term, creates an imbalance with nature and it can have drastic consequences. So she's gone from the dilemma, that's how she started, and then personal examples, and now to, unfortunately, this is what happens. So we have this, this is, don't do it. Then she uses examples here, and back again, even the most well-intentioned bird lover can upset Mother Nature. And so she's sort of saying, yep, I understand this is what you're doing, but do you know that this is what's going to happen? And so then we've got some graphic imagery here. We've got left uneaten in damp conditions, seed, bread rot, mould, disease, all this negative connotations here. Uneaten food attracts pests. So this is all the negative stuff again. So if we write negatively connoted, yep. So we've got examples there. The more food these pests get, the more they breed. So more dangers. Feeding birds is unnecessary. So part of this educating the reader as well. Native birds will be happy and healthy if left to eat their own normal diet of insects, nectar, seed and fruit. Most people don't realise that bread is the popular choice and it is one of the worst things. So she's pointing out these obvious points that when people read they'll feel as obvious, but beforehand they'll go, oh no, gosh, no. Giving it, supporting all these points with facts and some expert opinion. Then she says here, perhaps the real problem is not so much we are feeding the wild birds, but that people don't understand. So, you know, it's an inoffensive way of saying, hey, we need better education of this. So then suggests what should be fed. Okay, please, caps, try to do so as an occasional treat. If you must do this, then do it this way. Think of it as giving them a healthy snack, not a 5-course meal. So you're sort of getting told off, but not really. Then she does the full circle. As I watched those kids and their dad endlessly, this is the duck feeding dad, lob carbs into our beautiful clean lake, the wild ducks scrambling. She doesn't want to fight with them. She doesn't want to have a confrontation, but it's the conscience. It's back to the dilemma. I desperately wanted to take them under my wing and explain a few choices. So back to the dilemma again. So it goes that full circle. And then when we look at this last part where she asks, and it's like a call to action, what action would you have taken? Like, what would you do? Would you tell off the duck-eating dad? Or is it really just a bit of a warning to you? Hey, don't feed the birds. You thought it was okay, but it's not. This is reiterated by this cartoon, the second visual, which contrasts. It's a contrasting image to the first one. That first image of the photograph, do not feed the birds, very, very strong, very direct. This is humorous. And this I would describe as a cartoon of a lady who is feeding the birds, thinking she's doing a good thing. And in the speech bubble, here we've got one of the birds, or the duck, I think it's a duck. Hey, what about going easy on the carbs? So it reiterates an earlier point brought up by Loa. Now let's have a look here at direct answering of the big picture questions, what we can glean from that. Obviously, you have no time at all to be concentrating on writing out all these big tables and things, but this is an easy way for me to share with you. Did you think you had the same answers for this? So the issue and the context, first of all. Sharing conditions about the long-term effects of Strappleton residents feeding local birds. Yep, so we don't want the birds being fed. And, yeah, she's concerned about it, and this was her dilemma. Her audience, fellow members and residents of the Strappleton Community Voice Group. But Lower doesn't want to offend them, but she's got to educate them about the problem. So she's got a bit of a fine line here. The forms and features and tone, I put tone in there like part of the persuasive strategies. We know it's a social media post, hence it's usually in first person with I. There are 2 integrated or embedded images, and they're actually contrasting. They're very different. The photograph of the council sign warns people, so it's a warning, ominous tone. Not to feed the birds, or imperative tone, this is you won't be doing it, at the start of the post, and a light-hearted cartoon, focusing on the dangers of doing so at the end of the post. The images both exemplify and strengthen the line of argument being presented by Lower, while they maintain her carefully restrained tone. This is taken from an assessment report. This quote, she's being very careful not to offend her fellow members. Do Not Feed the Birds acted as a de facto title for the article, the post, which is very clear, as well as making a clear statement of Lower's contention. And imperative, the tone, which was given when this was, as I said to you earlier, this is the 2023 VCE English NHT exam that was used as the sample exam as well. And the imperative tone described in the external assessment report. The author, context and identity, we know it's Daphne Lower. She's a concerned resident and a member of this group. What's her purpose and how do we describe her argument style? Sometimes that can be really tricky. Lower seeks to educate fellow residents about the dangers associated with feeding the birds. Her photograph of the sign is very strong, direct warning or an imperative, while the rest of her post is less stern because she doesn't want to affect her fellow residents. This explains also the location of the contrasting image at the end, the cartoon. She combines a mix of personal experiences that her audience would know, and they're interspersed or spliced, alternated, with vital information from experts to educate the residents. So this is done very carefully. The actual construction, okay, now these are, look at how many points we've got here for construction. You cannot address all of them, but you must address contention. Do not feed the birds, and there's a need for better understanding. Then we have examples here. So probably we've got some points in mixed up. I thought it was bolded. I'm sorry. So here we have, this is support. Sign acts as a de facto imperative. Capitals make it direct. It warns the audience. Okay, then next point, she introduces the dilemma. Now, this is how it's framed. And shares experience of the duck feeding dad, totally ignoring the very clear message, and she uses first person. So we've combined our audience there. She isolates one line question with an ellipsis, and this reiterates her dilemma. What do I do? ... She uses an anecdote to describe the ill-formed practice of feeding birds and generalises. So here we've got lots of techniques. Everywhere, everybody everywhere fed wild birds back then, and today millions of Australians continue to feed wild birds. So then she offers valuable reasons. So I like this one as part of her argument. You know, she provides them with valid reasons for describing the feeding of the birds. People think it's kind, you know, so her audience doesn't feel that guilty. Then she introduces the needs for understanding. So these ticks are the argument points. And she talks about supplementary feeding and how it's wrong. And she uses a lot of negatively connoted words, downright dangerous, drastic consequences, can upset Mother Nature, introduce disease. So all negative words. Poor old pests, rats, mice and cockroaches, they're always negatively associated. Then she says feeding of the birds is unnecessary. Educates bread is one of the worst things. So once again, this, you know, informing them. And she returns to the dilemma. So she finishes off with this dilemma. back again. What do we do? What would you do? She puts it on them as a call to action. So she ameliorates, I love that word, to make something better or more bearable. She ameliorates the criticism with humour so as not to offend anyone, and that's that last cartoon. Now, so if we look here, we've got argument construction, contention, introduces dilemma, offers valid reasons for practice, introduces the needs for better understanding, feeding the birds is unnecessary, and returns to dilemma. You've got to think, okay, whatever argument points I discuss or analyse in my response, I must always think, where am I going to put the visuals? So visual 1, the sign, that can go here if we say, okay, this is my argument point 1, the contention, how it's set up, because the contention is very obvious at the start. So that would be one that I would definitely use. And introducing her dilemma, you might use that as a second argument point. She's caught between how does she educate these people who think these things. So I would work that point up into there. Introduces the need for better understanding. So this is looking a bit to me like an argument 3 point. So this is, supplementary feeding is wrong. Feeding birds is unnecessary. That's a bit the same. Could probably go together there. And then maybe her 4th point, returning back to the dilemma. Now, her dilemma all along is we're saying the duck feeding dad, he thinks he's doing the right thing, but we have to educate him. So all along we've really got this dilemma. So the first visual easily goes with the contention, and it's the strongest part of her I suppose, criticism of people, do not feed the birds. And this last visual is so as not to offend the use of the cartoon. So which of these points do you put that under? Which of the argument points? What is it actually reinforcing? So we can say here that she introduces the needs for better understanding. Feeding the birds is unnecessary. This is where I would put the second visual. You might not agree, you don't have to. But what I'm hoping to show you here is, even though there are so many argument points, you cannot discuss everything. So you've got to choose the key ones and make sure when it's an embedded visual or integrated visual that your visuals go under those argument points as well. The structure of the persuasive texts in the exam task. Sometimes you've just got to step back and have a look. Pretty easy. We've got one main written text with visual 1 and visual 2. This is the photograph and this is the cartoon. And this is a main written text. So we can see that both the photograph and the cartoon are embedded. They're not standalone visuals. Therefore, we need to analyse them under the argument points contained in the written text. Okay, now how do you structure your analysis? All right, so of course you need an introduction. We know that we've only got one main written text with embedded visuals, so we know we're looking at different arguments with visuals coming underneath them, not a separate paragraph for visuals. So you have your intro, of course, it has to be a formal structure. Now, however many body paragraphs you write, up to you. You might have 3 where you might deal with, your contention will be in your intro. So you might say opens argument with, you might put argument 1 here, and then your persuasive strategies to reinforce it or complement it, A2 and A3. And in A3, you might have how it's concluded. That's argument structure. So you might have a from the outset or the beginning, how the argument is structured, and these points here as well. You always need to think, where are you going to put these visuals? And we pretty much said we'd put the first visual here, and we also said that we would put the other one, arguments 3, back to the, you could put visual 2 back to the dilemma of people being not aware of things. So it could be 2 or it could be 3 here. Now, this particular structure has no separate conclusion, which is fine. No separate conclusion. You don't need to have a separate conclusion, particularly if it is just one main text with embedded visuals. And you can just finish with how the author concludes and audience impact. If you wanted to have a separate conclusion, you can, but as I say, it is not needed, and this is reiterated in examination reports. If you did want to have a separate conclusion, keep it really, really brief, maybe, and just address maybe overall audience impact, overall purpose and audience impact, but no repeating. And think about whether you actually need it or not. You don't in this case. If down the track, as the English course evolves, you're presented with 2 texts, 2 separate texts, you might, but entirely up to you. But please be reassured that it's not needed for one main written text with 2 embedded visuals. So writing the introduction, this introduction template is for one written text with integrated visuals, very similar to the first part of perhaps your SAC template, where you introduce your incident after, following, whatever the context or issue was, which could be the incident, the event, the experience, which would be Laura going to the park, an adjective, the author's name, the form contends that. Get straight into it. You don't want introductions that go on forever and ever. Half a page is fine. The author then frames or presents, and I would put in argument, style and structure if you can. Okay, don't summarise the argument. Just talk about how the argument is presented. And in a bid to, what is it? What is her purpose? She wants to inform, she wants to educate, she wants to stop this practice, whatever. And the audience impact. Author pronoun, because remember, we don't just say the name each time. Utilisation, I would put in a reference to the visuals linked to the argument or purpose in the introduction. Not meaning that's your only analysis, and don't say she includes 2 visuals. Like that's sort of very tokenistic. You need to have perhaps a very tiny description or how they are connected or how they are different from each other. Just something that you'll pick up on later. You can use this acronym, which is a fairly long one and fairly detailed, really not long, but there's loads of other ones, that students use or that you're familiar with. CCAP, you've got contention, context, audience, purpose. Some people like to have it this way. All sorts of things. Whatever works for you, it doesn't really matter. Okay? Just remember that templates are only to start with. You can move off them, and don't summarise the entire argument in your introduction. So now your turn. You write an introduction analysing the sample text. Use Pacifica acronym or whatever acronym you want to use and the template from the previous slide. Here's a sample introduction I've written, and I've highlighted here using different colours and numbers. Following a morning stroll in local parkland where she witnessed unnecessary duck feeding, so we've got part of that context and issue there. Concerned, Strappleton resident, Daphne Lower, author's name. Post, the form, on Strappleton Community Voice social page contends that. And so once you say contends that, we know the contention is following. Locals must not feed the birds and need to be better educated. So we've got 2 parts here about the wild birds' eating habits in general. Lower cleverly, I've put adverb in there, cleverly frames her argument. So speaking about her argument style now, as a personal dilemma, and structures it by alternating personal examples of well-meaning but ill-formed bird feeding practices. So here, really, this should be green. This is all argument style. So it's alternating personal examples of well-meaning but ill-formed bird practices with the facts from the expert. So it's like, I suppose I don't want to say overview because it really is just her style. She does this in an attempt to chastise, good word. So that is like to criticise her fellow members. So you've got a bit of overlap here. In the least offensive manner, as well as encouraging them to better educate themselves about the optimum wild feeding bird habits. So her utilisation, so here's our visual here, of two contrasting images. Remember, one's this very clear direct sign and this other one is sort of humorous. To bookend, that means start and finish, bookend her post at one end and at the other, also reflects this bid to ameliorate her criticism of the practice. Now let's look at writing body paragraphs. So this template is for the one written text with integrated or embedded visuals, and it uses the alpha plus V, meaning V for visual. So alpha, if we look here, argument, point, and sequence reference, usually in your topic sentence. Language strategy or techniques, persuasive strategies, a couple of them, not just single ones all the time. Maybe a feature of form that can be in there as well as a persuasive strategy, and audience impact, and then visuals. So you can use this acronym several times within the one paragraph or just space it out. Here we have author, argument, structure, terms. So looking at our topic sentence really. And then really what you're doing, you can vary your introduction. So you might want to put a quote that demonstrates the tone and then refer to tone rather than putting the actual tone word at the start, and then link to argument structure. And then once you've already done that, especially if it's like you've got two argument points of structure in one paragraph, you can usually say like, having referred to, having already established blah, 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 this point, then maybe there's a tonal shift and it moves on to something else and more persuasive strategies. Basically, you always have your argument point, strategies supporting them or feature forms, and audience impact. Now you have a go at writing a body paragraph 1. So this is the first paragraph after the introduction. Try to use the alpha plus V, because we said that we would put that visual in that first body paragraph, or any acronym that you use. So this is a sample body paragraph 1 that I've written. Lower begins her argument. So here we have that argument structure with a stark photograph of the sign, do not feed the birds. So we're talking about the visual, which employs an imperative tone. So that's given me an opportunity to actually introduce tone because I didn't have it in my introduction, and clearly voices her contention. So I'm using that meta language again, as well as acting as a de facto title for her post. So I've sort of linked it, the visual to her argument, contention, and the tone. And it was very strong at the beginning. Having directly stated her intention, she immediately lessens the intensity of this criticism and tone, which she does, by personalising the issue. So she then begins to talk about her experience and introducing the well-meaning but ill-formed duck-feeding dad and his children to articulate, trying to use more sophisticated verbs, her dilemma about whether to speak directly to the offenders about this unnecessary practice. So it's almost like she's using this example, but really is she talking about her fellow members? Her single line paragraph posing the question, what should I do if anything? This is what went through my mind, with its ellipsis, emphasises her indecision, as well as inviting fellow readers to ponder the issue and perhaps reflect on their own. You could have talked about their own behaviour. Lower repeats this pattern throughout her argument, as while she wants to educate her fellow residents and members of Strappleton Community Voice, she does not want to alienate, like really put them offside, any of them who may also be ill-informed bird feeders. So I'm hoping there that I've got the first key point that she used and how she begins her argument using this dilemma, that also how it impacts on her audience. Okay, so having written your body paragraph 1, of course you'll need to write a couple of more body paragraphs. And if you remember, going back to how we were structuring our analysis, we said, okay, we'd have our intro, BP1, and we put our visual in there, BP2, BP3, and I think we were putting our second visual in here. So we've got argument, 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 how the argument is built. Okay, and we said in this initial one, no conclusion, no separate conclusion. So therefore we have to have how the argument concludes itself here. Okay. Now, if we look at here, if you want to analyse a main written text with embedded images, as in the sample exam, it's not necessary to have this separate paragraph. So this is the form that we took, and this is how you might finish it. Now, you can't say things like, oh, well, your last paragraph shouldn't include the visual. No, there's no rules like that. Okay, so that's for this one. Now, if you want that separate conclusion, keep it to 1 to 2 sentences, focus on overall argument style, don't summarise the entire argument, do not repeat points and quotes, and really think twice about whether you need to include it at all. So for this activity, try to write a body paragraph 3, and that is a concluding paragraph. So it's going to have your argument point and how the author concludes. Is there a call to action? That is a very good thing to look for. This concluding paragraph, like your other paragraphs, they don't have to be the same size. So here is my concluding paragraph. So this would be a body paragraph 3. Lola concludes her post by revisiting her initial dilemma with the duck feeding dad, thus enabling her to elaborate on her need to politely explain a few choices that we can make to better care for our feathered friends. Her cartoon, depicting an elderly, ill-informed lady feeding the ducks at the lake area placed at the end of the post, acts as a contrast to the opening visual of the blatant warning sign, with the duck commenting in the speech bubble, hey, how about going easy on the carbs? Loa again offers her readers a gentle reminder of the need for people to be educated about the dangers of supplementary feeding of wild birds, and enables her to firmly shift her dilemma to that of her audience, when she employs a call to action, what action would you have taken? So this is my conclusion, but as you can see here, it allows me to bring up that last point about delivering a revisit to the dilemma, and it also allows me to talk about the argument style as well as audience impact, but expanding on the visual. So in summary, what to do and what not to do in the exam. What to do? Stay calm when you enter the exam. Arrange your pens, take a Zen breath, whatever it is for you to stay calm. In reading time, carefully read all the texts, including background information, and identify issue, purpose, forms, author, audience, overall argument style in your head if you can. And I would also look, what do you think are the 3 main points of the argument? How do they begin? How do they finish? And how is the argument built in the middle there? Write down useful acronyms to help you. Identify the contention, argument sequence, that's just how it's built, and key language techniques. Remember, you can't identify everything. Write a strong and clear introduction. Leave 2 lines after your introduction in case you need to add more points. Include sentences that link persuasive strategies to audience impact. Say how. Always think how. And then with your audience, why? Why might the audience feel this way? What is What is the author hoping to achieve? What's the purpose here? Always link language techniques or persuasive strategies to arguments. Don't have them hanging out there. Make sure you have analysed the visuals and edit your work. Step 3, neat crossouts are fine. 7 deadly sins. Don't do. Don't write a summary of persuasive text with quotes instead of an analysis. Don't just list all the persuasive techniques used without connecting them to any argument points. Don't analyse visuals as separate texts when they're embedded in the written text. Don't make up tones. Don't make up tonal shifts. Don't compare texts if you get more than one big one. Don't compare them. Analyse paragraph by paragraph instead of sequences of argument. Don't analyse absolutely everything. You can't. Decide in your reading time, okay, here are my main points. I'll let that one go. That one can join up to that one. It's really the same thing. And often with some of the main texts, unlike the 2023 one, there might be preamble at the start that's really not part of an argument, just a sort of a connection with the audience. Be careful there. Do not fail to edit your analysis, especially your introduction. If you don't have much time, focus on that intro above everything else. My name is Andrea Hayes. I'm an experienced VCE teacher and assessor. Okay, what's in this lesson? We have 2022 exam task and assessment criteria, 2022 external assessment report advice, really, really important. And we have 3 steps to approaching the task, 3 general steps. 1, answering the big picture questions. 2, identifying argument sequence and the persuasive language used, including visual. And 3, how to write your analysis. We also have some sample response paragraphs, and we have 2023 update top 10 exam tips. Now, I need to point out too, keep an eye out for these guys, key terms, important subject-specific vocab to use, like precise meta-language, and also this colour box, which will have difficult vocab, some vocab that might be a bit challenging or tricky to understand. Now let's have a look at the 2022 exam task and assessment criteria. The task asks you to write an analysis of the ways in which argument and written and visual language are used in the material on the following pages to try to persuade others to share points of view being presented. The assessment criteria for the exam is holistic. 3 main points. 1, understanding the argument presented and points of view expressed. 2, analysis of ways in which the language and visual features are used to present an argument and to persuade. And control and effectiveness of the language use as appropriate to a task. This is your own language. So this is linked to my tip, be a triple threat. You need to be able to understand and analyse how the argument is constructed, how the persuasive language works together with the argument to position an audience, and you also need to focus on how you write your analysis, how your analysis can be fluent, cohesive, and demonstrate complexity. This report advises that students need to focus on how argument is shaped and why it is developed this way, why it is sequenced and ordered in this manner, how the language is used to weight argument and to position an audience in a particular way, and why these decisions are so consciously and deliberately made by a writer. A writer just doesn't ad hoc write an argument. The writer carefully plans the orders of the main point and what's going to be most effective and where. And also how a writer may use themselves, their status, their identity in the construction of an argument. If they are the president of some association, do they have expertise themselves? Really, really important. The report also commented that while it was quite appropriate to structure the analysis on the development of the argument and move sequentially through the material, an ability to work across the material was another mark of higher scoring responses. That to me says, don't analyse every point. Think about that big picture a lot more. What is the writer's purpose? What do they want to convince their audience of? It also says to me, don't write a summary of every point. Talk about how the argument is constructed. So think carefully about what you need to analyse. You cannot analyse every single point, nor should you try. Also, the report states there are no expected responses in Section C. Students can identify different contentions according to how they interpret the material. No expected responses, no absolute expected format except introduction body paragraphs. There is never an expectation that everything in the article has to be identified and analysed. This is impossible. Pick the main points, the points that really move the argument or develop the argument strongly. Concentrate on those or some pivot points. Assessors must be able to decipher students' handwriting to ensure that their responses can be assessed. This, unfortunately, is becoming a little bit more of a problem. You need to look at your own handwriting and very early on and figure out how you can improve it so that it is always legible if you have a problem. Might simply mean changing your pen, leaving more space between words, maybe printing instead of cursive writing. Maybe there's certain letters you need to concentrate on, etc. Ask your teacher for advice. And the last part here on this slide tells us that the average for Section C is 5.6. Okay, approaching the task, we need to know what textual forms we are dealing with. When you look here, you can see this is one main written text, long one, and it has two visuals, visual 1 or graphics and visual 2. Now you need to download the 2022 complete exam task and read through. You'll see a link at the bottom of the screen. Now let's look at step 1, answering the big picture questions. Of course, you've already read the texts. You need to have read the texts and then ask these questions. What type of issue are you dealing with? How did this issue arise? Was there an event that precipitated or acted as a catalyst for this issue? What is the writer or the writer's purpose? How did the writer present themselves? Their identity, what is their context? Status. How does the writer sound? What textual forms are used? Now we know that this is a podcast transcript and it has 2 graphics. Who is the likely target audience? And how might they feel or think or act in response to the argument and why? These are all the big picture questions. Now let's look a little bit more closely at the actual exam task. First of all, there is the task that says you have to analyse the ways in which argument, written and visual language are used, to persuade others to share the points of view presented. Background information is the first thing that you are presented with, and it is super important. It can tell you lots of things. Writer's name for a start, the form, the issue, proposed development, and more form here, images. Lots of other little things you can pick up, but it's a good place to start and foolish to not read it. When we look here, we have an image. The first image, it's not a photograph. You're fine to say it's an image or a graphic. It appears at the start of the podcast transcript, and you need to ask yourself, what does it depict? And then later on, you have to think, how does it link to the contention? Does it support the contention or an argument point, or does it challenge it? It is your opinion, and there can be different interpretations. There's not only one set interpretation. You will notice through these next few exam text slides that we have some shading. The orange shading refers to argument points, and it also has the superscript number 1. And the yellow shading refers to evidence and persuasive strategies used, and that has the superscript number 2. And this will be in different places in the paragraph, but often you usually see the argument point early on in the paragraph. So let's have a look here. We've got an argument point very early on, recent development plan that has been proposed for the Hapsi wetlands, one of the very last protected sanctuaries in this local region. And we have the yellow highlights. I'm your host, Janelle, friendly tone. Our wetlands, inclusive language. Okay, local newspaper being flooded with letters and emails, being flooded, like lots of them. Subtle sort of persuasion. Down here we have paths are narrow and unpaved. Walkers have to be careful, but this means the native flora is taken care of. So we have a sense of responsibility being developed here very early on. Here in paragraph 3, we can see that the argument point is very clearly located in the first sentence of the paragraph. But now, our wetlands seem to be just another area of Hapsi under threat of destruction. You can also see that there's overlap here too, that probably we could have coloured this bit yellow as well. This is an example of how things are blended in a piece of exam text. So once again, here we have more evidence and persuasive strategies. So Tanley, the writer, talks about experience of people bringing proposals for developments to council meetings disguised as plans to protect the environment. She's causing doubt. She's asking, a question, and she's using not too subtle sort of persuasive denigration there. And then further down here, in fact. So here we have facts. Destruction of natural home of over 40 species of grass to put up money-making ventures. So lots and lots of good persuasive language used here. Like paragraph 3, paragraph 4 has an argument point very early on in the paragraph. As locals, we are guardians of this area. Very, very carefully playing on audience's responsibility, and being guardians of this area is such a big task. And then following it up with, once again, lots of evidence and persuasive strategies, but it's couched with a we know from experience. So it's got this real doubt and questioning the nature and adventure group who are behind this proposal. Lots and lots of good stuff here. Here we have paragraph 5, another argument point early on in the paragraph. Current development plan will only be the start. And then we've got attracting walkers, cyclists and cafe patrons. So we've got a bit of a list happening here. Now here we have the second image or graphic. It's a photograph. We do need to note that. And to give a brief description, to me it's a bird from a wetland and trying to get something out of a plastic bag, rubbish. Right? That's my opinion from a plastic bag. No doubt the plastic bag being dropped by humans. Now, some students see different things in this. They see that there's actually something living inside the bag, different sorts of things here. They describe the bird differently than I do. That doesn't matter. You have your interpretation and you need to think, how does it support the contention or an argument point being used? Does it complement? Does it challenge, etc.? Does it enhance? Here we have paragraph 6, which you can see is fairly short, but includes lots of evidence and persuasive strategies to support earlier points. So here we have the last two paragraphs, paragraphs 7 and 8. And you can see here we have an argument point further down the paragraph this time, fairly strong. Can we trust Nature and Adventures Group's mission statement, having caused all this doubt and by asking all these questions earlier? Worst case scenarios, etc. And then lots of evidence. The last paragraph, we must consider, even that is strong language, what is best for our wonderful wetlands. I would love to hear from you, listeners of HAPSI Happenings. How do you feel about this? In a sense, is a call to action, especially with leave your comments on my website. So now let's have a look at step 2, identifying argument sequence and persuasive language. One of the key takeaways here is that you need to think about how the sequence of the argument and the persuasive language work together to create an impact or position the audience. So let's have a quick look. One of the first parts of the argument praises the existing wetlands. Does this how? Because we're always asking how. Personal friendly voice, uses an image. And then what is the audience impact, likely audience impact? Evokes a sense of local pride and local responsibility for environment. It can be more than one. Okay, but if we say that's point 1, this is point 2, introduces Nature and Adventures Group Plan as a threat. And this comes straight after praising the wetlands, so it's quite a contrast. Then together when he does that, or when she does that, we have the negative connotations, and then we have that reference to guardians of the area. So we've got a change in tone happening here, tonal shift. What does that do? What impact does that have on the audience? Creates fear and mistrust of Nature and Adventure Group's motives. And then it might make the locals feel more protective. Okay, it's all deliberately done, all this argument, sequence and adding the strategies. If we go to our third point, the author or writer proceeds to villainize the group. This might make them out to be really bad. Predicts a doom scenario, denigrates their claims. So how do they do this? They cast doubt. They say, believe that if you like. Some of it's really obvious. And they use this emotive visual too, the photograph of the bird in the rubbish in the wetlands. And that rubbish is put there by humans. What effect does this have on the audience? Further develops fear and makes the locals feel even more protective, which is similar to the previous point, but they build on it. Fourth point, the writer encourages locals as the guardians, because that was previously stated, so that was set up earlier, to further distrust the NNA group. How? Series of questions, okay? And then actually blatantly states, isn't this just a selfish attempt to paint a commercial venture in a favourable light? Commercial meaning money-making. Audience impact, once again, further increases fear about the environment, and yet again, locals may feel more protective. And this last point used by Tanley to call to action, okay? And you do that in a very strong way, or you can do it pretty subtly, but asks the locals to comment, okay? To actually make a decision and say something. How? Consider what is best for our wetlands. There's that our, that inclusive. We're responsible for this. And this encourages locals to feel more responsible, of course, but to actually commit to writing a comment, having a voice on the issue. Now let's look at step 3, writing your analysis. It's important to note here that the following slides are extracts from the 2022 VCAA examination report and some extracts that I've written myself. It is not an essay in its entirety. Also, you need to note that here we have colour coding, and the orange again represents an argument point, but this time in your own analysis, and that has superscript number 1, like before. The yellow is the evidence and persuasive strategies you will discuss or analyse in your analysis, and that's yellow or superscript number 2. Positioning of the audience, your analysis of that is in blue, and that is superscript number 3 as well. And the pink, superscript 4, is an example of linking sometimes the persuasive element with an argument or sometimes with the positioning of the audience. This one's a little bit trickier to pick up and isolate. So let's have a look here. I'm not going to read all the paragraphs, but I'm just going to point out some obvious points that perhaps would be a really good idea for you to include. So at the start of this one, we have what we call a little bit of an outline, often only half a sentence, about how the issue arose. So if you can remember that, that's pretty good to put in. How issue arose. Often you will get this from your background information. Also important to note, author's name. Who exactly, author or writer, who exactly wrote this? Okay. In this case, because it is an introduction, one of the most important paragraphs in your analysis, our argument point, of course, is our contention. And this is prefaced by the word contends, that really good contention verb. Then we have other points here to point out. The fact that cartoon and visual are mentioned, so that's visuals times 2 mentioned. The form, that it's actually a podcast script, and the fact that it is a dichotomy, the 2 parts, presented between ideal present and potential devastation is more of that big picture. Really good to put in your intro. Here's another introduction sample. This one more succinct. In recent podcast episodes, so here we have outline, author's name or writer's name, once again we have the contention, our argument point, and we have evidence. So here we've got tone, concerned, then critical tone. That's a tonal shift. And then we also have 2 contrasting images, actual description of the images, but we still say that they are the forms. And here we also have how Tanley, the writer, positions her audience. So she decries, we could probably colour that, not sure what colour, but it's part of the contention really. She decries to her fellow nature lovers in an attempt to galvanise some sort of significant opposition to the proposed development. So it's a clear reference to her purpose and audience impact. Here we have a high-scoring body paragraph, once again from the 2022 VCAA examination report. You can see here very clearly that the argument point is like a topic sentence at the start of the paragraph. What else is also good to note is transitioning from a self-assured tone. So that in effect is a persuasive device, changing a tonal shift at the very start of this argument point, which is really good, followed by a quote that is an evidential quote. That is, it's evidence of that tonal shift. And then describes the tone as ominous, that warning tone, or foreboding will only be the start. Very clearly followed by Tanley argues. So here is a point of the argument. So it's a lovely introduction to the argument using tone. Very, very well done. Okay, when we look a bit further down, we can see that positioning the audience doesn't always occur at the end of the paragraph. It can occur throughout the paragraph. This is also really well done too. Doesn't have to occur every time you mention a persuasive strategy or persuasive language, but it also is not restricted to once only in a paragraph and at the end. You've got a lot of flexibility here. Evidence and persuasive strategies here, we've got words and phrases and then they're quoted. Okay, so important to include that evidential quoting, not just sticking a quote in because it may look good. Here's another example of a body paragraph. This body paragraph also includes a reference to the visual or one of the visuals. So here we have topic sentence that introduces the argument at the start, followed by evidence of persuasive strategies. Then also a positioning of the audience. After this, we have the image. So this is the visual placed at the start of the transcript. Reflects the protected notion as it depicts. So it's linking it to a point made earlier. Here we also have, important to note, a linking sentence here in the pink. Given her lifelong local status, so this is actually a persuasive device that's probably been mentioned earlier in this essay, her anecdote, so we've got two devices here, together with inclusive statement calling her like-minded readers as guardians, so we've got three things here of our wetlands, emphasises the vulnerability of the area. So this pink sentence here is an example of linking the persuasive strategies, how they work together to create some sort of feeling or emotion. And then quickly followed up by positioning the audience, as well as likely imbuing readers with a sense of responsibility to maintain their status as protectors. So it's a paragraph that has an argument point. It includes some persuasive strategies. Then it goes further and talks about how these strategies that have been used are then worked together, combined to link to the audience impact. Here is another example of a body paragraph, this one a high-scoring paragraph with reference to a visual from the 2022 VCAA examination report. You can see here we have clear argument point at the start, lots of evidence and persuasive strategies with positioning to the audience straight after that. Very clear. Lots of evidence in this paragraph. Here we have, again from 2022 VCAA examination report, an example of part of a paragraph analysing a visual. So you can see how it refers to the argument. So we don't know what's gone on prior in this paragraph, but it talks about the composition of the image with the bird implied as miniature. So it actually talks about positioning it next to leaves and the bird looking small. And then it draws parallels to claims that nature is delicate. So this is like an argument point here. So it's drawing parallels, it's in support of Tanley's claim. And then, it's to bolster sympathy and genuine care. So this is audience impact as well. So you've got all sorts of things happening here, but they're all blended together. Contrastingly, and this is still within the image of that bird in the wetland with the rubbish, the dull grey colour of the plastic scrap held by the bird relates to Tanley's emphasis in her ubiquitous, now I love this word, ubiquitous, being everywhere at the same time. So it's an example of perhaps Tanley's overall points that are woven through her whole piece and how the visual actually relates to all of it as well as just parts of it. Here again is another sample paragraph with an analysis of the visual. You can see here that we have clear argument point in the topic sentence, evidence with quotes, and we've got some meta language there. So we're looking at, denigrates. We're looking at exclusive terms, blunt statement, lots of different things. Large, disturbing photograph. Your visual is a persuasive strategy as well. So then we've got, after that, we have this linking sentence, a more obvious one here. By combining this image, so already mentioned and analysed, with her continual attack on the group's claims. So these two things working together, leading to audience impact. So this is an example of like a linking sentence where you are linking the persuasive devices to the audience impact, really not so much in an obvious manner, but moving it forward, how it's progressed in the argument. Now here is a sample final paragraph. Notice here that we haven't called it a conclusion. When you have one major text with embedded visuals in the exam, you don't need to have a separate conclusion. Your final point that you make or analyse with this one text will actually be your conclusion. If you have several texts, then that might change and you might write a very short conclusion. But when you have one long main text, just your final point can act as one. Here we have the final point addressed at the start of the paragraph. We've got employs, our good how verbs, so then we have a series of questions, one of those persuasive devices, how that's used. And then we've got implying that the company, so, reading between the lines a little bit, guilty of greenwashing, great word, and their development is just a selfish attempt, so highlighting what they really think is happening. These targeted questions, so here's our linking sentence, these targeted questions placed at the end of her podcast are likely to act as a final reminder of the reasons why not to trust Nature and Adventure Group and encourage readers to think about what is their number one priority. Now you could add here, if you wanted, you could add her comment to her listeners, remember it's a podcast, to actually commit and make a comment, and you could use that call to action as one of these final points as well. Okay, let's look now at top 10 exam hints. Number 1, write concise introductions. Please don't let them go for pages and pages. 3/4 of a page is fine, even less. Make sure they include contention or contentions, an outline or context, sentence, half sentence. You can include purpose, audience, and mention the text forms. If you're uncertain about your introductions, I strongly suggest leave 2 lines between the introduction and your body paragraph. In case you forget something, you can arrow it in on the same page. Number 2, always weave analysis, visual analysis into your paragraphs, unless, of course, the visual is a completely separate text. Number 3, don't forget, analyse how and why arguments have been developed or constructed, sequenced, in order, it's all deliberate. 4, remember to say how the argument and the language, persuasive language, work together to influence or convince the audience. What is the impact? How are they positioned? And why is it done this way? 5, study the fast 4 ways to improve your vocabulary. And you can do this on Edrolo. Ensure that each piece of your quoted language is accompanied by analysis. Avoid writing a summary with quotes. Make sure that your quotes are evidential quotes. That is, they are evidence of the persuasive language or strategy that you are talking about. Number 7, ensure that your tone analysis includes quotes of language that demonstrate the creation of the tone and address the likely audience impact. Don't just invent tones, and you do not have to analyse or discuss tone in every paragraph. Number 8, always edit your work. Check for accurate spelling, quoting, paragraphing, and that you have included analysis of visuals. Try when you practice under timed conditions to factor in at least a 5-minute check at the end. Crossouts are fine. They are evidence of editing. Number 9, take a dictionary into the exam, but practice using it beforehand. Number 10, remember that you are not expected to analyse every point in media texts.